Fiza Morrison stood at the altar of the small frontier church, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the borrowed wedding dress. It wasn't hers. Nothing was hers anymore, but she wore it anyway, hoping that for at least this one moment, it would be enough. Her heart hammered in her chest as the sun began to dip behind the stained glass windows, casting colored light across the pews and her tear-streaked face. The crowd, gathered for what was supposed to be a joyous occasion, had become a quiet, judgmental sea of whispering townsfolk. They watched her, some with pity, others with judgment, as the minutes stretched into hours. 3 hours, to be exact. 3 long, torturous hours that felt like a lifetime. She had waited, hoped, and prayed. But Thomas Fairfield, the man she was to marry, never came. She could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall, each second mocking her. Her stomach twisted with humiliation, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on her. The sun was sinking lower now, casting a warm, golden hue over the room, but it only made her shame sharper, more real. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked down at the floor, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She had tried to keep calm, but now, standing alone at the altar, it was all too much. She felt the eyes of the townspeople on her, their whispers sharp and cutting. Her mind raced. How could he do this? How could he just abandon her like this? Fiza had tried to steady herself, but she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the sting of tears she could no longer hold back. Her hand reached for the small bouquet she clutched, the flowers wilting in her grip as her fingers trembled. There was nothing left to do but face the truth. Thomas wasn't coming. The pastor, who had been quietly standing off to the side, shifted awkwardly, not sure what to say or do. He cleared his throat, glancing nervously toward the door, as though expecting Thomas to walk in at any moment. But the minutes dragged on, and the silence became unbearable. Fiza's heart shattered. This wasn't just a broken engagement. It was the end of everything she had hoped for. It was her future slipping through her fingers like sand. She had to get out of there. She couldn't stand another minute under the weight of their pitying looks. Without a word, Fiza turned and hurried out of the church. The cool air hit her face as she stepped outside, and the distant sound of the town's church bell seemed to echo her broken heart. She wasn't sure where she was going, just away. She had no home to return to. Her aunt, Martha, had made it clear that she would never be welcomed back in her house. The debts her father had left behind were too much to bear, and without Thomas, she had no hope left. She walked quickly toward the train station, the dust of the town's main street swirling around her. With every step, her mind grew more determined. She would leave this place. She would find somewhere far away where no one knew her, where no one would whisper behind her back. She would start fresh. At the station, she sank onto the wooden bench, burying her face in her hands. The sting of her broken heart felt unbearable. Her breath came in uneven sobs as she fought to regain some semblance of control. The sun had fully set now, the sky a deep purple, and the train tracks gleamed in the fading light. She could hear the distant rumble of a train approaching, but it felt so far away, just like the future she had hoped for. As the train pulled closer, Fiza wiped her tears away, clutching her small bag tightly. She was ready to leave, to escape, but then the sound of hooves broke through her despair. Fiza looked up, startled, as a man on horseback approached the platform. His figure was tall and confident, his boots clinking against the wooden ground as he dismounted. The townspeople at the station gasped when they recognized him. A wealthy rancher, James Dalton, who was known for his reclusiveness. He had always kept to himself, but his reputation was well known, and his wealth was rumored to rival that of the town's richest merchants. He tied his horse to a nearby post and walked toward Fiza. His eyes, dark and steady, landed on her tear-streaked face. "Miss, are you the bride left waiting today?" he asked, his voice low, yet kind. Fiza blinked, unsure of how to answer. There was something about him, something in the way he looked at her, that made her feel both seen and unseen at once. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, she forgot all about the town, the broken wedding, the humiliation. She nodded slowly, still unable to find the words. James Dalton paused for a moment, his gaze never leaving her face. Then, with surprising tenderness, he spoke again. I have a proposition that might save us both. Faiza's breath caught. This man, this stranger, was offering her something she couldn't even begin to comprehend. What was he suggesting? What did he mean? For the first time in hours, Faiza allowed herself a small, fragile hope. James Dalton's words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over Faiza like a blanket. I have a proposition that might save us both, he repeated, his eyes never leaving hers. For a moment, she wondered if she had misheard, if the exhaustion and heartbreak had made her delirious. But no, the man was standing before her with a calm, assured expression that left no room for doubt. She searched his face, looking for any sign of mockery or pity, but found none. He was serious, his gaze steady and kind, yet something about him, his posture, his confident stance, made her feel as if he wasn't just a stranger offering an impossible solution. He seemed like someone who had lived 100 lifetimes, someone who was used to taking charge, but in this moment, there was no arrogance in his manner, only an odd sense of empathy that caught her off guard. Faiza opened her mouth to respond, but the words got stuck in her throat. She couldn't fathom what he was suggesting. Why would you do this? She finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. James paused for a long moment, considering her question as if it required more than just a simple answer. Because no one should face this alone, he said quietly, his voice sincere. And because I can. His words struck her like a blow, and she felt the sting of them deep inside. It was as if he saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one had before, but also frightened her. She had been abandoned once today, left at the altar by someone who had promised to stand by her. Now, here was a stranger, a man she knew nothing about, offering her his hand in a way that felt too surreal to trust. She swallowed hard, feeling a knot form in her chest. She wasn't sure if she should run away or accept his strange proposal, but the sense of desperation that had been gnawing at her for hours made it impossible to ignore. Marry me instead, right now. Save yourself this shame, James said, his voice unyielding but gentle, as if he was offering her a lifeline, a way out. His words hit her like a storm. She stared at him, stunned, unsure of what to say. Right now? She asked, the absurdity of it all sinking in. He nodded once, his eyes never leaving hers. If you wish it, I'm not asking for anything more than what you're willing to give. The simplicity of his offer was both overwhelming and incomprehensible. The fear that had gripped her heart for so long suddenly gave way to something else, a fleeting sense of possibility. Could she do this? Could she walk away from her past, from the broken dreams, and step into a new life with a man who was offering her an escape, a fresh start? Aunt Martha, who had been running frantically down the platform to find Faiza, reached them just as the conversation was coming to a head. Her face was flushed with exertion, but when she saw James standing there, her eyes flickered with something. Relief, perhaps, or something else. Faiza couldn't tell. Take it. You have no choice. Aunt Martha hissed, her voice sharp and urgent. Faiza blinked at her aunt, her heart heavy with the weight of her words. She had never felt more abandoned than she did in that moment. Martha was only thinking of herself, of the family's reputation, of escaping the scandal. But what about Faiza? What did Faiza truly need? Her thoughts were a whirlwind, her mind caught between the temptation to leave everything behind and the fear of the unknown. James's steady gaze kept her anchored, and for the first time in hours, she felt a sense of clarity. If she refused, she would stay in this town, humiliated, discarded, with nothing to her name but the remnants of broken promises. But if she accepted, perhaps she could forge a new path, one she chose for herself, not dictated by anyone else's expectations. She turned her eyes back to James, her voice shaky but resolute. "Then yes, I accept," she said, her heart pounding in her chest. The moment the words left her lips, it was as though a weight had been lifted. Her decision had been made. James gave a small nod, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then let's not waste any more time." Without another word, he helped her to her feet, and they began walking toward the church, where the stunned townspeople awaited them. The air felt charged with tension as they entered the church, the silence heavy and thick. Fiza could hear the soft murmur of whispers behind them, the astonished gasps from the few who had followed them. No one could understand this, least of all her. But somehow, the decision felt right. The pastor, still reeling from the earlier events, seemed unsure of what to do. He fumbled through the ceremony, his hands shaking as he struggled to find his place in the book of prayers. Fiza barely heard the words, her heart in her throat. All she could think about was the man standing beside her, the man who had just made her his wife. James reached into his coat pocket and produced a simple gold ring, which he slid onto her finger. It was modest, unadorned, but it felt heavy with the weight of its promise. The kiss they shared was brief, formal, respectful, but it sealed the deal in a way Fiza had never imagined. The crowd erupted into murmurs of shock and curiosity, but Fiza's mind was elsewhere. She had made a choice, one that would change everything. As they left the church, James helped her into his fine carriage, the horses already hitched and ready to go. Fiza's few belongings had been packed in the back, her life now reduced to a few items in a small bag. The journey to James's ranch began in silence, the weight of what had just transpired settling over her. Fiza turned to him, her voice soft as she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since his offer. "What do you expect of me?" James glanced at her, his eyes steady, and for a moment, Fiza saw something in them, something she hadn't expected. "Only what you wish to give," he replied quietly. "This is your choice." The ranch loomed ahead as they neared their destination, the sun sinking lower on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the vast land. The house, large and imposing, seemed to rise from the earth itself. Fiza's heart fluttered with uncertainty as she took in the grand sight. What was she walking into? What was James's true intention? As they pulled up to the grand entrance of the Dalton estate, Fiza stepped out of the carriage, her mind a whirlwind. She was now Mrs. James Dalton, bound to a man she barely knew, in a place that was foreign to her. The uncertainty of her future loomed ahead, but one thing was clear. Her life was no longer her own. It belonged to this stranger who had rescued her from the depths of her humiliation. The morning after her hasty marriage to James Dalton, Fiza awoke in a bed far grander than any she had ever known. The room was large, its walls lined with dark wood and delicate wallpaper, the air fragrant with the scent of roses from the garden outside. She blinked in the soft morning light, the reality of her situation slowly sinking in. She was no longer just Fiza Morrison, the woman who had been abandoned at the altar. She was Mrs. Dalton, a title she had never expected to hold. Her gaze wandered to the window, where she could see the sprawling estate stretching out before her, vast fields and pastures, the sun rising over them in hues of gold and orange. The silence of the house was broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards as the servants moved about. It felt like another world entirely. Fiza swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the soft rug beneath her. As she stood, her heart raced with nervous energy. She had no idea what to expect from this new life, but it felt as though it was waiting to swallow her whole. The house was beautiful, but it felt empty, as though it was waiting for something or someone to breathe life into it. She dressed in the simple but fine clothing that had been laid out for her, and as she descended the staircase, she was greeted by Mrs. Fletcher, the housekeeper, who was a warm woman in her 50s with a kind face and a no-nonsense attitude. "Good morning, Mrs. Dalton," she greeted, her voice gentle but firm. "We've prepared breakfast for you. I'll show you to the dining room." Fiza nodded, unsure of how to respond. She followed Mrs. Fletcher through the large, echoing hallways, the house feeling like a museum, beautiful but impersonal. The dining room was massive, with a long table that could easily seat a dozen people. The silverware gleamed in the morning light, and the room smelled of fresh bread and coffee. As Fiza sat down to eat, she noticed the other servants quietly going about their duties, their eyes flicking to her every so often. She realized that they were watching her, not with curiosity, but with expectation. They knew something she didn't, and it unnerved her. Later that morning, after breakfast, James left for the ranch with his foreman, Miguel, and Fiza was left alone in the house. The emptiness of the place felt suffocating. She wandered from room to room, each one grander than the last, but all of them unused, abandoned. Dust covered the furniture, the air thick with the smell of disuse. There were large, beautiful rooms, sitting rooms, parlors, libraries, but no sign of life. Fiza found herself standing in front of a tall, ornate mirror in one of the rooms, staring at her reflection. She barely recognized the woman she saw. She wasn't the same person who had walked down the aisle in that borrowed dress. This woman was someone else, someone who had been rescued by a man she didn't know for reasons she couldn't fathom. What was her place here? What was James expecting from her? The silence of the house pressed in on her, and she felt as though she was suffocating. She needed to do something. She needed to feel useful. She walked outside, her feet crunching on the gravel as she made her way to the neglected gardens. The flowers were overgrown, the weeds choking the life out of the once beautiful space. Fiza rolled up her sleeves and began to work. She didn't know what else to do. The physical labor helped to clear her mind, even if only for a moment. The morning passed in a blur as she pulled weeds, trimmed back the overgrown vines, and tried to restore some semblance of order to the garden. She found a strange sense of peace in the work. It was something she could control, something she could make beautiful. Later, when James returned from the ranch, Fiza hesitated before approaching him. She wasn't sure how to act around him or what he expected of her, but he surprised her. As she stood in the doorway, looking out at the fields, he approached her with a basket of lunch. "I thought you might like to join me in the fields," he said, his tone soft but casual. "I don't usually take breaks, but I thought today might be different." Fiza looked at him, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't expected kindness from him. She had expected distance, formality, and perhaps even resentment for being forced into this strange marriage. But instead, he seemed genuine. His gesture felt like a lifeline, and she took it. Together, they sat in the fields, the warm summer sun on their faces, and ate the simple lunch James had brought. He spoke little, but there was a calm in his presence that made Fiza feel less alone. The conversation was light at first, about the ranch, the land, and the work that needed to be done. But as they sat in silence afterward, Fiza found herself glancing at him more than once. He was a man of few words, but there was something in his eyes, something that hinted at a deep well of pain that he kept hidden. She wondered about him. What was his story? What had brought him to this point? As they walked back to the house, Fiza couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to James than met the eye. He wasn't the cold, distant rancher she had imagined. There was something broken inside him, something he kept buried beneath layers of formality and restraint. She had yet to learn his full story, but as she passed the front door, she caught sight of a photograph on a shelf in his study. The image was old, faded at the edges, but it was clear who the woman was, Catherine. James had loved her, Fiza realized. And then she was gone. The realization struck Fiza hard. This house, this estate, this life, none of it was truly his. It was hers, She was only a ghost in his world, a stand-in for a woman who had never had the chance to live in it. But as she turned to leave, Mrs. Fletcher entered the room and, without a word, placed a hand on Fiza's shoulder. "That was Miss Catherine," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of sorrow. "She was supposed to be the one here." Fiza nodded, understanding more than she cared to. This house, this life, was built for someone else. But perhaps, she thought, she could find a place here too. She wasn't sure how, or even why, but for the first time since arriving, she felt like she might not be completely alone. The next day, as Fiza continued to tend the garden, a letter arrived, forwarded from the town. It was from Thomas. He apologized, explaining that he had married a wealthier woman instead of her. He admitted he had been courting both women, but ultimately chose money over love. The letter ended with a cowardly apology and no sign of remorse. Fiza read the letter and felt something unexpected, not heartbreak, but anger. He had humiliated her in front of the entire town, and now he was confessing his betrayal with no real regret. James found her sitting on the bench in the garden, the letter in her hands, her fists clenched at her sides. Without saying a word, he sat beside her, offering a handkerchief. For the first time, they sat in silence together, the words unspoken but understood. Fiza realized something in that moment. She had stopped thinking about Thomas. He was no longer the man who had shaped her world. In his place, something else was beginning to take root. A month passed since Fiza's whirlwind marriage to James Dalton, and though the initial awkwardness still lingered between them, something had begun to shift. Fiza had started to settle into her new life, though it felt as if she were living on the edge of two worlds. She no longer felt like an outsider in the house, but the vast estate still felt more like a monument to James's past than a home for her. She had continued to care for the garden, finding peace in the simple, repetitive work that gave her something to hold on to. Her relationship with the staff had deepened too. Mrs. Fletcher had become a quiet, constant presence, offering advice and gentle guidance on the ways of the house. Miguel, the foreman, had shown her the ropes of the ranch, and the stable hands had been kind, if a bit reserved. Despite the distance James kept, Fiza had begun to feel a strange sense of belonging in the life she had been thrust into. The mornings were still a blur of silence, as James left early for the ranch, but it was in the evenings, when he returned, that something changed. One morning, after a week of seeing him barely look at her, Fiza made an effort to join him in the fields, bringing a basket of sandwiches she had prepared herself. She had no idea what she expected, but when she found him on horseback, overseeing the ranch workers, he was surprised, then pleased by her presence. He stopped and dismounted, and they sat together on the grass, sharing lunch as the ranch bustled around them. It was simple, quiet, but something shifted between them during those moments as they spoke about the ranch and its needs. He seemed touched by the gesture, though he remained distant in his usual way. And Fiza couldn't help but notice how much she appreciated this man who had so much more beneath the surface. But as she spent more time with him, she began to realize how much of him remained hidden. There were moments when his eyes softened, when she caught glimpses of vulnerability, but they were fleeting. He had loved Catherine, the woman who had died, and the house they lived in was a testament to that lost love. Fiza had felt an odd mixture of pity and frustration when she discovered the photograph of Catherine in James's study. Catherine had been beautiful, young, and filled with life. Fiza could see, even in the faded picture, that they had shared something deeply personal. Mrs. Fletcher had explained the woman's tragic death, and Fiza had understood. Catherine had been the woman James had planned to build a life with, and her untimely passing had broken something inside him. He had built the house for her, and once she was gone, he had sealed off his heart. Fiza wasn't sure if she felt sadness for James or jealousy for a love that was lost to the past, but she couldn't ignore the fact that she was now a living replacement for someone who would never be forgotten. Still, Something changed the day James showed her the land. After weeks of barely acknowledging each other beyond necessary conversation, they had begun to talk more, share more. He had started teaching her the ways of the ranch, and though the lessons were simple, they were a quiet bridge between them. One evening, he had invited her on an early morning ride, and the way his hand brushed against hers as he passed her the reins sent an unfamiliar flutter through her chest. It wasn't romantic, it was subtle, a quiet connection, but it was there. They began to ride together regularly, sometimes in silence, other times discussing the ranch and the future, but always in the calm, beautiful mornings before the world awoke. There were other moments, too, when they would find themselves sitting at the long dinner table, exchanging stories of their pasts. Fiza shared memories of her childhood in the small town where she had grown up, of her parents' deaths, and of the relentless pressure she had felt to marry for survival. She spoke of her Aunt Martha's coldness, how she had never felt truly at home in the house that had once been hers. James listened, his gaze never straying from her face, and in those moments, Fiza began to see him less as a stranger and more as a partner, someone who understood pain, who had his own ghosts to wrestle with. The laughter, though tentative at first, slowly became more frequent. They began to share stories over dinner, and with each conversation, a little more of James's hard exterior seemed to crack. He spoke of the past, the death of Catherine, the years he had spent working to keep the ranch alive, and for the first time, Fiza saw the depth of his grief. He had not married her to replace Catherine, she realized, but because he had known what it was to be abandoned, to lose someone he loved, and in her, he had seen someone who could fill the emptiness that had remained in his life. Fiza's heart began to soften toward him. She was beginning to care for him, not because he had rescued her, but because he had shown her in small, quiet ways that he understood what it was like to be lost. But they still weren't close, not in the way she wanted. She longed for something more, something deeper than simple companionship. One stormy night, as thunder rumbled in the distance and the house was cast in shadows, they found themselves alone together in front of the fireplace. The rain hammered against the windows, and the fire crackled as they sat in silence. There was a tension in the air, something that felt like it could break, but neither of them spoke. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm inside her. She found herself leaning slightly toward him, wanting to bridge the gap between them. But at that moment, the lights flickered and thunder cracked loudly, breaking the tension. Neither of them moved, and Fiza realized that perhaps the truth of their relationship was still too fragile, still too new. They were both afraid of what lay beneath the surface. But that night, as she lay in bed, staring out at the storm, something inside her shifted. She was beginning to fall in love with him, not because of the kindness he had shown her, but because of the man he was becoming in her eyes. James wasn't perfect, and neither was she, but for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to imagine a future with him, one where they were no longer strangers. It was the beginning of something that could, perhaps, become everything. The arrival of Richard Blake at the Dalton estate threw everything Fiza had come to understand about her new life into disarray. James had invited him, an old friend, to stay at the ranch for a few days, but Fiza sensed immediately that something was off. Richard, a city businessman with a sharp tongue and colder eyes, carried himself like a man who was used to getting what he wanted. He was charming, but it was the kind of charm that felt practiced, as though it hid something darker beneath the surface. His eyes constantly flicked toward Fiza, sizing her up, as if trying to determine just how much of a woman she really was, something that made her skin crawl. The first evening after Richard's arrival, Fiza overheard James and Richard speaking in the study, their conversation low and tense. Richard was pressuring James to sell off the surrounding ranches to make way for a resort, a development project that would displace the families who had lived on the land for generations. Fiza's heart sank as she listened, her mind racing with the implications. She knew James wasn't the type to bow to pressure, but Richard was holding a trump card, documents for the water rights, something crucial to the survival of the ranch, something James could not afford to lose. The next day, Fiza found herself at a crossroads. The tension in the house had grown unbearable, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away from her, something she had only just begun to find. Richard's presence was like a shadow over everything, and as she sat in the study later that afternoon, reading over some of the ranch's books, the weight of the situation began to dawn on her. She was no lawyer, but her father had been a clerk, and he had taught her how to read and understand legal documents. As she scanned through the papers James had been sent, she spotted a loophole in the water rights claim, something that could allow James to hold onto the land and protect the local families from being driven out. Her hand shook as she realized what she had to do. She took the documents to James, who had been sitting in silence in his study, staring at the papers with frustration etched across his face. When she explained her findings, he looked at her in surprise, as if he had never considered that she might be able to help him in this way. "You're remarkable," he said, his voice full of admiration. Fiza felt a surge of pride, but it was fleeting. Richard's words from the night before lingered in her mind. She had been a replacement, a stand-in for a woman who would never return. She had seen it in his eyes, the way he looked at her sometimes with a distant sadness that wasn't for her. Fiza didn't know how to reconcile what she had come to feel for James with the growing doubts in her heart. She had given him her trust, but now, as she stood beside him in the study, it felt as though she was losing him again, this time not to the past, but to a future she couldn't control. That evening, Richard approached her in the garden, his manner suddenly more forceful. He was not a man to take no for an answer, and his words carried a poison that made Fiza's stomach turn. "You're just a replacement, Fiza," he said, his voice smooth but cutting. "You'll never be more than a shadow of Catherine. You'll never be the one James truly wanted." Fiza recoiled, a chill running through her as his words sank in. "You're wrong," she replied, her voice trembling with anger. "I'm not a replacement for anyone." But Richard wasn't done. He continued to press her, offering her money, a life of luxury if she left James, if she chose him instead. "James doesn't love you," he said. "He's just using you to fill a void. You'll never have his heart. You'll always be second choice." His words hit her like a slap, and for a moment, doubt crept into her mind. Was she truly just a substitute? Was James's kindness nothing more than pity? The seeds of insecurity planted by Richard's words began to take root, and Fiza's heart grew heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Later that evening, she found herself standing in front of the large mirror in their bedroom, staring at her reflection, lost in thought. Her mind raced, replaying the conversation with Richard over and over. Had James ever truly seen her, or had he only seen Catherine in her? Did he love her, or was she just a woman who had been left behind by a man who couldn't move on? The next morning, Fiza couldn't keep the question inside any longer. She needed answers. When James returned from his morning rounds at the ranch, she confronted him, her voice shaking with the fear of what she might hear. "Am I just someone to fill the space she left?" she asked, her heart pounding in her chest. James froze, and for a moment, the silence between them stretched out like an eternity. He was standing so still, so painfully still, that Fiza wondered if the question had cut too deep. Finally, he spoke, but his words came slowly, carefully, as though he was searching for the right thing to say. "Fiza, you don't understand. I never wanted you to replace her. I never asked for you to carry her memory. But somewhere along the way, I started seeing you, not as Catherine, but as you." His voice faltered, and for a moment, he looked lost. "But I don't know how to love again. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I ever will." His words left Fiza breathless, a mixture of relief and pain sweeping through her. He had admitted it. He wasn't ready to let go of the past. He wasn't ready to love her the way she needed him to. Her heart broke for him, but it also broke for herself. "I should have known," Fiza whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I was convenient." She turned away from him, the door to her heart closing just a little. She needed space. She needed to figure out what to do with the love that had begun to bloom in her chest. She couldn't keep waiting for something that might never come. As she packed her few belongings that evening, a part of her wanted to run, to leave him behind and escape the pain of the uncertainty. But deep down, she knew that if she left, she might never find the courage to love again, and she might never forgive herself for walking away from the one man who had truly seen her for who she was. The following morning, Fiza stood in front of the bedroom window, staring out over the sprawling ranch, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her chest. She had barely slept the night before, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and heartache. The confrontation with James had left her shaken, but it had also made one thing painfully clear. Their relationship was fractured, and they were both standing on the edge of something they couldn't fully grasp. But despite the doubts, despite the fear that she was simply a replacement for Catherine, Fiza realized something else. She wasn't the same woman who had been abandoned in the church. She wasn't the same woman who had walked down the aisle in a borrowed dress, desperately hoping for a future she couldn't control. She had changed. She had fought to survive, to rebuild her life, and now she had to make a choice. It wasn't about whether James loved her. It was about whether she was willing to love herself, whether she could truly see her own worth apart from the man she had married. As the morning wore on, Fiza found herself once again at the heart of the ranch, standing before the gathered townspeople. James had insisted on accompanying her to the community meeting about Richard Blake's development plans. It was a small act, but for Fiza, it felt monumental. She had never imagined that she would stand before the people of the town, not as the woman left behind, but as a force to be reckoned with. As she entered the meeting hall, the room went quiet, the murmurs dying down as people took their seats. Fiza's heart raced as she stepped forward, but when she looked at James, standing beside her with an air of quiet confidence, she felt a surge of determination. She had been thrown into this life, forced to accept a future she never chose, but now she was ready to claim it as her own. As the discussion of Richard Blake's plans continued, Fiza raised her hand, her voice steady and clear. "I've reviewed the legal documents," she said, her words cutting through the tension in the room. "There's a loophole in the water rights claim. If we file a counterclaim, we can protect the land from Richard's plans. We don't have to lose everything." The room fell silent, and Fiza could see the surprise in James's eyes. He hadn't known she had such a sharp mind for business, but it was more than just her intellect. It was the fire within her, the fire that had been kindled by months of uncertainty, by the shame of being abandoned, by the realization that she was capable of standing up for herself, for the people she now considered her family. James's eyes softened, a look of pride and something deeper crossing his face as he stepped forward, his voice full of admiration. "My wife is right," he said, his tone firm. "This land, this ranch, it's ours, and we will fight for it. We will protect it, for our people and for the future." Fiza's heart swelled at his words, not because they were what she had been waiting to hear, but because they signified something deeper. James was no longer the man haunted by the past. He was here, in this moment, choosing her and choosing the future. The rest of the meeting passed quickly, and by the time it was over, Richard Blake's plans had been halted. His anger was palpable, but there was nothing he could do to reverse what had been set in motion. As the townspeople filed out, murmuring in approval, Fiza found herself standing next to James, her heart still pounding, but now filled with a sense of purpose. She had made her mark, and she had done it not because of James, but in spite of everything. That evening, as the last light of the day faded from the sky, Fiza found James in the barn, tending to the horses. She had seen him in moments like this before, quiet and introspective, but tonight was different. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of everything that had transpired. Fiza approached him slowly, her heart beating louder with each step. When she reached him, she hesitated for just a moment, then spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I read your letter," she said. James froze, his hands stilling on the reins. The silence stretched between them for a moment, but then he turned to face her, his eyes filled with something Fiza couldn't quite place. Hope, fear, longing. "And?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Fiza looked at him, the words she had been holding back for weeks finally tumbling out. "I was terrified of being second choice," she admitted, "of always being a shadow of the woman you lost. But I understand now. You loved her, and I can never replace her. But that doesn't mean I can't be loved. That doesn't mean I can't love you." James's eyes filled with emotion, and for a moment, Fiza saw him not as the man who had saved her from humiliation, but as the man who had carried the weight of his own grief for far too long. "You're not second choice, Fiza," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "You never were. I just needed to learn to love again. And now, I can't imagine my life without you in it." The words hung in the air, a promise between them, a promise to let go of the past and build something new together. Fiza stepped closer, her heart brimming with the love she had kept hidden for so long. She reached out, touching his face gently, and for the first time, she saw the man she had married, not just the ghost of Catherine's memory, but the man who had chosen her, the woman who had found her own strength. "James," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm not the same woman who was abandoned. I'm the woman who chose you, and I always will." In that moment, as they stood together, the past faded into the distance, and the future seemed wide open, full of possibilities. James leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was full of everything they had both been holding back, a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. The next day, Fiza walked through the gardens, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the strength of the earth beneath her feet. She had chosen to stay, chosen to fight for the life she had now, and she knew in her heart that this was just the beginning. Together, she and James would build a life, one rooted in love, not in the shadows of the past, but in the light of a future they would create together. And as she looked out over the land, she knew that they were no longer just surviving, they were truly living. The days following Fiza's decision to stay felt like a rebirth, a reawakening of a life she had thought lost forever. As the winter months rolled in, the once barren ranch was beginning to hum with life and promise. The garden, which Fiza had painstakingly nurtured, had begun to show signs of life, the roses and wildflowers now blooming in riotous color against the backdrop of the snow-covered fields. The house, too, had transformed from a place of cold silence to one of warmth and shared laughter. The staff, who had watched her cautiously at first, now regarded her with respect and even affection. She had become a presence, a true member of the Dalton household, and her confidence grew each day. James, too, had changed. His grief over Catherine, though never fully gone, had begun to loosen its hold on him. He no longer spent hours lost in his thoughts, his eyes distant as he stared out over the land. Instead, he had started to embrace the life that was before him, and that life was now undeniably intertwined with Fiza's. There were still moments when he would retreat into himself, the weight of his past settling on his shoulders like an invisible burden. But Fiza had learned to read him, to understand the silences and the quiet moments of reflection. She knew now that these were not moments of retreat, but of healing. They had found a rhythm together, their lives settling into a comfortable pattern that both reassured and excited her. The early mornings, when they would ride together across the fields, had become her favorite time of day. There was something sacred about those quiet moments, just the two of them, the world around them still asleep. It was during these rides that they began to open up more to each other, sharing stories, dreams, and the quiet fears they had never voiced. Fiza had never imagined that she would find peace in such a place. But here, amidst the land that James had once built for someone else, She had found her own footing. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They had created something together, something that neither of them had expected. It was during one of these morning rides, just as the sun began to rise, that James turned to her with a look in his eyes that Fiza had not seen before. One that was filled with a depth of emotion that seemed to echo all the years of pain, hope, and change that had brought them here. Fiza, he began, his voice low and hesitant, I've been thinking a lot about the future, about what's next for us. His words made Fiza's heart quicken, the anticipation of what was to come swirling in her chest. She met his gaze, steady and calm, knowing that whatever he said next, they would face it together. This ranch, he continued, it's not just a place for me anymore. It's not just a house built for Catherine. It's our home, Fiza, and I want you to know that it's yours too. The sincerity in his voice made Fiza's heart swell with emotion. She had never doubted James's feelings for her, but hearing him speak those words, seeing the conviction in his eyes, was more than she could have imagined. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the acknowledgement that they were no longer living in the shadow of the past, but standing together in the light of a shared future. But just as their relationship had begun to heal, and just as Fiza had begun to see the possibility of a life built together, a storm from the past appeared on the horizon. Thomas Fairfield, the man who had abandoned her on their wedding day, arrived in town, his presence like a shadow over the bright future Fiza had built with James. He had arrived with his new wife in tow, the woman he had chosen over Fiza, and though she had heard whispers of his arrival, she had never expected to face him again. It was at the church, the same church where she had waited in vain for Thomas to show up on their wedding day, that she saw him once more. Fiza stood beside James as they walked into the church for the Christmas service, the warm glow of the candles casting soft light across the pews. The townspeople greeted them with warm smiles and nods, their respect for Fiza now well established. But it was Thomas's presence that caused her heart to race. He was standing near the back of the church, his posture stiff, his face shadowed with regret. His new wife, a sharp-faced woman with a demanding air, stood beside him, looking uncomfortable in the peaceful setting. When Thomas caught sight of Fiza and James, his face tightened, and he stepped forward as though compelled to speak. Fiza, he said, his voice heavy with something Fiza couldn't quite place. He faltered, clearly uncomfortable, but Fiza wasn't interested in his apology. She had moved past the point of caring. She had long since buried the pain of his abandonment, had made peace with the fact that he had never truly seen her. She had found a new path, one that was filled with people who valued her for who she was, not for what they thought she could offer. Fiza looked at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. I forgive you, Thomas, she said, her voice calm and clear. You gave me exactly what I needed. You left. If you had stayed, I would have never found him. She nodded toward James, who stood beside her, his presence both comforting and strong. Thomas seemed taken aback by her words, and his wife, who had been glaring at Fiza, looked at her with a mix of surprise and resentment. I'm sorry, Thomas muttered, though there was no true remorse in his voice. I thought I was making the right choice. Fiza didn't respond. There was no need. She had nothing left to say to him. He had made his choice all those months ago, and in doing so, he had given her the freedom to choose her own path. That path had led her to James, and she would never regret that decision. As they walked out of the church, hand in hand, Fiza felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The ghosts of her past, of Thomas and the shame she had once carried, no longer haunted her. She had forgiven him, but more importantly, she had forgiven herself. The future, once a distant dream, was now a reality. That night, as they sat together in front of the fire, James turned to her with a soft smile. You were incredible today, he said, his voice full of admiration. Fiza smiled, her heart full. I'm not the same woman who waited for a groom who never came, she said softly. I'm the woman who found everything I was meant to have. In the months that followed, the Dalton estate flourished. Fiza and James worked side by side, building a life that was rooted in mutual respect, trust, and love. They celebrated the changing seasons, their laughter echoing across the ranch as they navigated the challenges of running a large estate. Fiza had found her place, not just as James's wife, but as a partner in every sense of the word. As winter turned to spring, the estate seemed to come alive in ways that mirrored their own journey. They were no longer haunted by the ghosts of their pasts. Their love had become a testament to the strength of second chances, to the power of choosing each other every day. 1 year after their hurried wedding, Fiza stood in the garden, her hands cradling their newborn daughter. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the land, and James stood beside her, his arm around her waist. Their daughter giggled in Fiza's arms, her tiny fingers reaching for the flowers around her. Fiza looked at James, her heart swelling with the realization of how far they had come. "What if Thomas had come?" she asked, her voice soft with wonder. James smiled, his eyes full of affection. "Then I would have missed my chance to find the right woman. The woman who was waiting for me all along." Fiza chuckled softly, her heart full. The memory of that abandoned wedding day no longer felt like a burden. It was a part of her story, yes, but it was no longer the defining chapter. They had written their own story, one that was full of love, of second chances, and of the family they had built together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Fiza looked around at the thriving ranch, the laughter of children echoing through the air, and she knew, with every fiber of her being, that this was where she was meant to be. This was her home. This was her family. And this was the life she had fought for. The life she had chosen.